Welcome, everyone. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thanks for joining us today for this next seminar in the Puna Haumaru seminar series. Today, it's really exciting for me to introduce my colleague, Dr. Anna Sutton. Anna is a senior lecturer here at the University of Waikato in organisational psychology. She specialises in the application of psychology to understanding and improving our work lives and workplaces. Her research and publications centre on the role of personality, authenticity, and self-awareness at work, particularly investigating how those things influence our well-being. So today, Anna is here to talk about some work that she completed with Professor Devin Plaszczak on critical incident recovery. I'm really excited to hear about it. I hope you are too. So over to you, Anna.
Thank you, April. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to introduce myself a little bit more. Thanks, April, for that quick intro. As April said, I'm a lecturer in organisational psychology here at the University of Waikato, and I'm here on behalf of myself and Professor Devin Plaszczak, who I'm sure many of you know in her role as director of the NZISCS Institute. I would like to also take the opportunity to introduce myself in Te Reo. Tēnā koutou katoa ki te mana whenua o tēnei rohe, tēnā koutou. No ingarangi ahau, kei kirikiri roa ahau e noho ana, ko ana ahau. Ka nui te mihi ki a koutou. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So what I would like to do in this session is to introduce you to some of the research that Devin and I conducted in collaboration with New Zealand Police, and we were focusing on their reintegration programme for officers who'd been involved in critical incidents. So how can we get people back to the workplace safely and confidently when they've been through a critical incident? Now, the report that we did for the police was pretty huge, and I'm not going to take you through all of the details, but what I'd like to draw out is some of the things we can learn for this, for how we can support people who go through these tough times, how we can get them back to work, and particularly things that might be relevant outside of the police as well. So I'm hoping that by the end of the session today, you've got some insight into what the police are doing and also how we can take these lessons and apply them elsewhere. So first of all, what is a critical incident? It does get defined in many different ways, but essentially it's an event that somebody goes through that involves serious injury or the death of a person, or sometimes the threat of serious injury or death. In this research, we were limiting it to officer-involved shootings. That's where this reintegration programme started. It was to help officers who'd been involved in shootings to get back to work. Now, critical incidents are life-threatening events, and so our normal response to those kinds of events as humans is distress, anxiety and fear, and those kinds of responses are there to help us to avoid similar situations in the future. But the challenge that we have with police officers and many other frontline workers is that their roles involve them experiencing that normal response and then going out and actively engaging with further threatening events. So it becomes really important for the organisation as a whole to find a way to support those officers so that they can return to work safely and confidently after those incidents. Our approach to this was to focus on recovery. We started this research project, as we do with many good research projects, with a literature review to find out what have people found in the past. And what we found was that much of the research literature focuses on non-recovery. It looks at where people's response to the critical incident is medicalised. So it looks at how do people respond to these events and really how does it go wrong? So what are the symptoms and how do we treat the symptoms? Yet what we found in our review was that serious mental disorders as a result of these critical incidents, things like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, are actually relatively rare, and most participants in most studies have a recovery trajectory and they develop a new normal. It may not be what they were before, but they do recover over time and they develop that new normal. What we also found was that there was relatively little research on the organisational aspects of critical incident impact and recovery. And as an organisational psychologist myself, I thought, well, this is no good. We've got normal people in their normal work lives going through these incidents, and yet we know almost nothing about how their workplaces are helping them or hindering them in their recovery. And finally, we found that when we were looking at the things that get put in place to support people, peer support is a very promising but underutilized resource. So people were saying in these studies that being able to talk to peers was very helpful, but it was very rarely used as a method to help people back into work. So that gives us some background in terms of where this reintegration programme fitted with the overall research. We were looking for ways we could understand the response to critical incident in terms of a recovery trajectory rather than just a medical model, as well as bringing in some of the organisational aspects of how we can respond to critical incidents. So the Police Reintegration Programme here in New Zealand was adopted a few years ago and adapted from the successful Edmonton Police Reintegration Programme in Canada. And that programme has been running for a few more years than it has over here. And they have trained people over here, given us insight into what we need to do, what sort of things worked well for them. And then the police here have adapted that programme to suit the New Zealand context. The basic approach is that when there's a critical incident, officers who are involved in it are assigned a reintegration officer. And that reintegration officer is an experienced and trained colleague who can provide them with three things. The first is peer support. So they have somebody to talk to who knows what they're going through and can be a listening ear. Secondly, there's a more practical aspect to the programme, which is where the officer is exposed to the kinds of sensory inputs, sort of the smells, the sounds of that incident, and to sort of work through those cues and feel more confident in how they can manage that situation. So that could be going to the firing range, just feeling the gun and using it again in a situation where there isn't that external stress and pressure. So it's in a safer environment, they can try it out and get more comfortable with it again. The other part of that is that there may be a scenario that's associated with the critical incident. They may work through sort of where was I standing? Could I have done anything else? Should I have shot earlier or later? And all of those questions that often come up can actually be worked through with this reintegration officer. And finally, that reintegration officer can offer tailored support and follow-up to suit what that individual actually needs in the moment. So that's an overview of what the reintegration programme looks like in terms of that specific support from a reintegration officer. But they're not on their own. So the officer involved in a critical incident, you can see them in the centre of this circle. There is actually a whole web of support around them. And in the research project that we did, Devon and I found that it was this overall support that was really important. That reintegration programme with that officer is essential, but it is part of an overall process. So we talked about this as a multidisciplinary wraparound support system. The officer has access to a psychologist, they have access to a wellness advisor, they have a silo who's a critical incident liaison officer, and that's just someone who provides a single point of contact. When these critical incidents happen, obviously there are very complex processes that get kicked off. Lots of people will maybe need to talk to that officer, and so it helps to just have one person who acts as a filter there. And then there's the managers and colleagues who can provide formal and informal support as that person returns to work. And very importantly, at the bottom here, right at the foundation, we've got the family who are not only affected by the event itself as it impacts on their family member, but also provide support to that officer as well. So you can see that reintegration is part of this overall network of support. Now, our role, Devon and I were brought in to evaluate the reintegration programme itself. And I won't go into all the complex details of the research methodology or anything, but overall what we did was we interviewed officers. Those were people who had been through a shooting-related critical incident, and they were either from before the time of the reintegration programme, or they had been through the reintegration programme after it was introduced. So we were able to compare these two groups of officers. We also spoke to staff involved in the programme, such as psychologists, wellness advisors, managers, and so on, to get an understanding of the wider context of that programme. Then, as I mentioned earlier, I'm an organisational psychologist. Devon is from a clinical and forensic psychology background. And so we brought those two quite different perspectives to understanding what people were telling us. So we used two different types of analysis, which I won't go into here, but if you would like details, you're welcome to contact me. So we were looking at themes and how things unfolded over time, so temporal sequence. So what did we find? It is a 100-page report that we produced, so I'm not going to go through every single one of those 100 pages. I'm going to focus on the main findings for the overall evaluation, and then pick out some of the key things that I think we can use in other situations and we can use to understand how people respond to these critical incidents. So our main findings in evaluating the programme were, first of all, that we found substantial benefits. So this reintegration programme, since it was introduced here in New Zealand, has helped officers to return to work safely and confidently. It's reduced the likelihood of those longer-term mental health problems. Remember, I said earlier that a lot of the research looks at the symptoms that people suffer from after critical incidents and has that focus on a medical model. And what we found was that the introduction of this programme had actually reduced the likelihood of those problems and had set people on a better path to recovery. Thirdly, introducing this programme, it went beyond just supporting those officers in their individual situations. It demonstrated more widely to the organisation as a whole that the people's well-being was cared about, that this organisation had put something in place to support officers who did their jobs and faced these difficult situations because of that. So that contributes to the overall wider support that that organisation is showing for their officers. And overall, we found that there's a dramatic improvement on the typical recovery course when we compared it to people who had gone through these incidents before the reintegration programme was introduced. So we saw some dramatic improvements for those officers who went through the programme. Of course, no programme is perfect. And so we also identified some areas for improvement as that programme expands. And some of those I'm going to be mentioning as we go through this. Some are more specific to that programme, so I won't be covering them. But things like how do we keep that individual tailoring of the programme with the need for standardising it. So we'll explore some of those in a bit more detail as well. That's the overall evaluation of the programme. And what I'd like to move into next is some more specific things. So the focus today is on the insights that we found in this research that we think can help with critical incident recovery more widely. Now, this probably incomprehensible picture here is just a visualization of our thematic analysis. So it's looking at all the themes that we drew out of the research. And what we're going to do today is focus just on a few of these areas. Firstly, how do those critical incidents affect people? What are the elements of the reintegration programme with a particular focus on peer support? And then finally, what are those organisational factors that might influence how well people recover and respond to that critical incident? Let's start with that first one. What actually happens when someone goes through a critical incident? I'm going to summarise some of these things and then give you some quotes from the officers themselves that help to illustrate what was going on for them. There is, of course, the typical post-trauma response to a critical incident. That's things like hypervigilance, difficulty sleeping and concentrating, intrusive recollections of the events, and anxiety. For example, one officer said, "I struggled to sleep for probably about a week afterwards and had a lot of ruminations. Like every time I wasn't talking, I was just reliving that experience." So it's very common for the officers to ruminate over what happened and often to second guess themselves. Did I act in the right way? Could I have done something differently to change the outcome? They also reported over time there were longer term changes in their sense of identity and who they thought they were, but also their knowledge about themselves. So, for example, one officer said, "It's not like the movies, their guys just shoot people and the next day they carry on shooting more people. That just doesn't happen. These events are with me for life, even after my career ends." So what we're talking about here are life-changing events, and it's about how people come to terms with that and make sense of it. The final main thing that came out in terms of the impact that these events had on officers was what they learnt from that experience when they reflected on it. And for many of them, it was about making themselves into better officers. For example, it's made me into a better cop because then it prevents stuff happening. It means that people are becoming more aware of the situation around them. Their situational awareness is improved and it helps prevent things from escalating. Other officers said things like it made them more compassionate towards other people because they realized what they had been through as well. So you can see some wide-ranging, often long-term effects of these critical incidents. The most striking finding here was that the effect of the critical incident had patterns. We saw similar patterns across people, but the unique trajectory that each individual had was unique to them. There was nothing that we could say, this is definitely what will happen to any individual. So we saw patterns, but there was definitely unique trajectories. That means that any response we make as an organisation, so anything that the police put in place, has to be tailored to the individual if it's going to meet the needs that they have. Which brings us on to what was the response of the organisation. So what is the reintegration programme? It consists of these three elements that I mentioned earlier. So there's the peer support, there's the firearm handling, and then there's the scene reconstruction. These are three main elements of the reintegration programme. First of all, that peer support. This was very highly valued. Just like in the previous literature we'd looked at, the officers involved in the shootings identified peer support as a critical help through this process, and it served three main functions. First of all, it gave people the recognition that they had a shared experience. So this officer said the peer they knew, and they knew that I knew how hard it was to make that decision to shoot. And I remember just a massive weight leaving my body when I was talking to them. So simply being able to share that experience with someone is very supportive for those officers. Secondly, there was practical advice, things like people there who are on the same journey but they're at different stages. So you hear things, you get some understanding, like, about doing exercise straight after. So it's just about practical advice. How do I deal with this reaction I'm going through, and what have other people found helpful in the past? And then thirdly, there was normalization, that what I'm going through is a completely normal response to a very unusual and dramatic event. And this is possibly one of my favorite quotes from the entire research, because it really just sums it up in a nutshell. So it's recognizing that I am normal. What I'm going through is normal. So what was best practice in this peer support was that those peers were able to provide a listening and non-judgmental ear. They were able to just listen to those other officers, not judge them for what they did, because they themselves knew how difficult it was. The peers were able to also explain their own experience without trying to compare war stories or saying, oh, you think that was bad, mine was much worse, or something like that. It was just being able to talk to someone who had had a similar experience or knew what you were going through. And third was about being factual about what had happened rather than trying to sugarcoat it. So recognizing that this was a serious incident, not try to gloss over it, and just be upfront and clear with people. So the peer support was the first element of this. The second element was firearm handling. And the aim here is to desensitize the officers to the sensory aspects that could generate acute symptoms. So what we mean by that is just hearing the sound of the gun could cause all the feelings of that shooting incident to come back. Things like anxiety. They could even re-experience that critical incident. And this is very well illustrated in this quote, where someone went to the range as part of this process, and they said that hearing that gunfire, I think that sent a chill up my spine. I felt sort of like afterwards, I was like, wow, the adrenaline sort of just kicked back in. So it's recognizing that the first time we hear or smell or touch anything associated with that critical incident, our bodies may react as if that incident is happening again. So it gives officers the opportunity to go through that, but in a safe place where they're not having to respond to an incident itself. We did find that before this programme came in, a lot of officers were sent straight back out into the field, and the first time they, say, handled the gun again was in a very similar situation to that critical incident, and they had to somehow control themselves enough to be able to do a good job as well. So giving people that safe space to experience this was really important. And what this does is it helps the officers to build their own confidence that they are ready to get back out there and continue with their jobs. So this officer said, I didn't think I would freak out when handling a gun again, but I was like, what happens if I do? It was the unknown that was scaring me. So it gives those officers the opportunity to get that operational expertise back, get that comfort with the firearms without being in the thick of it. And then finally, what we have is the third arm of this reintegration programme, which is around scene reconstruction. And this is something that the reintegration officers work through with the officer involved in the shooting that helps them to talk through and work through any doubts or questions they had about the incident. This comes after the evidentiary interview. So it's not about checking my story works or anything like that. It's just for the officers to work through doubts or questions that they might have had. And one of the officers said, the scene reconstruction was just like the last piece of the puzzle that I needed. Many of them often ruminate about the event. They go over and over it, and they have lots of doubts and questions, and it just helps to put that to rest. It's also an opportunity for the reintegration officer and the critical incident officer to talk through how the recovery is tracking and perhaps identify things that they might want to discuss with the psychologist in the next session. So here's a quote from one of our psychologists that emphasised this, saying, how do I, as a psychologist, know that someone is ready to go back to full duties? Well, I don't, but we need to put them in a situation that's similar enough to the critical incident, and then we find out. So it really helps to identify further things you might want to talk about with the psychologist. Overall, what we learned from this was that just as the individual has their own unique response to a critical incident, but it does show patterns across people, there are also unique reintegration needs. And so we need a basic structure for that reintegration programme that can be tailored to the individual. We also found that this reintegration programme only works when it involves consultation between the whole support team to support that officer. It's not the case of this works if you just take a tick box approach of let's go to the range, fire a gun a bit, and then you go back to work. That's not what the point is. The point is that it's working with the officer to provide the support that they need in their specific situation. And that does vary wildly between different people. So we've looked at how the critical incident affects people. We've looked at what the reintegration programme is and the elements that are important in supporting them back to work. But there's also a wider context for this, and this is the organisational factors. These are things that happen within the organisation that are important in either aiding that officer's recovery, or they may even contribute to ongoing distress because of how that officer is treated by the organisation. And there's a couple of powerful quotes here that I'd like to illustrate this with. This person said that it wasn't the taking of a life that really caused me the most stress. It was the way the police treat you. That basically caused 70 to 80% of the long-term stress. Now, the officer is not saying that the incident itself was easy or anything like that. It was just that it was how they were treated afterwards made it all a lot worse. That was the long-term stress. That was what was interfering with the recovery journey after a critical incident. And I think this next quote illustrates very well the responsibility on an organisation to look after its employees. You know, you trained me, I did a job, fix me, or help fix me. We train these officers to do particular jobs, then they carry out those jobs, and then it's up to that organisation to say, right, you did the job we trained you for, now we'll help you get back to work. There is good news for certainly for the New Zealand Police. They've been working on this for a few years now, and what we've found is that there is clear evidence of improvement in how officers feel that they're being treated by the police. So what we've got here is a graph showing how often the officers talked about these three things. So we've got reintegration officers at the top. So these were people who went through the reintegration programme. That's the lighter blue or grey. And then we've got officers who went through the critical incidents before the reintegration programme was in existence. So you can see that people who've been through the reintegration programme are way more likely to report being treated well, much less likely to report being treated like a criminal or devalued. Whereas those who had to basically find their own way through the incident without any support were much more likely to feel they'd been treated like a criminal and that their efforts were devalued. So this is good news in terms of the reintegration programme, and thinking more widely, it shows how putting in place a programme like this can actually help change the culture of the organisation a bit, shows that it demonstrates to the officers that they are important and that they're being treated well by the organisation. So I'd like to take you through some of these organisational factors in terms of thinking about the organisational context as a whole, then looking at the role of leaders, and then looking at the role of connection with our colleagues. In terms of the organisational context, there have been big changes here over the last few years in the police force. And the first is that the recognition and awareness of mental health has become much more important and much more accepted. So this is a good quote from one of our officers saying, look, I've been to the psychologist a number of times. I'd highly recommend it to anyone. Gone are the days of when you didn't go and see the psychs because there was something wrong with you. So there's a bigger acceptance of the fact that you can go to psychologists who talk about these things, that mental health is as important as physical health for doing a good job. The second is around preparation and training. When we were talking to the officers, we found that those who had had more preparation and training were more prepared to deal with the critical incident and tended to have better recovery afterwards. And this is not just practical firearms training, although that is important, but it's also about understanding our normal physiological and psychological responses to high stress. So why is this happening to me? For example, why can I only remember parts of what happened? Why did I get this tunnel vision? Why am I still feeling so psyched up a week later? What's going on? And we had this great quote from an officer that said, I'd spent a long part of my career actually training for this, but no one prepares you for it. Like, you know, they train you to make the right decision, but not how to cope with it afterwards. And so this is quite important in terms of the general training that officers get, or anyone working on the front lines or subject to critical incidents, is not just training of what to do, but how to cope afterwards. A third issue is around that multidisciplinary team. Remember, I showed you that picture at the beginning of all the people involved in the support for the officers. What we found was that it was really important that there was open communication between those people and a recognition of different people's expertise, that the focal point is supporting that officer back to work rather than people protecting their particular area. And this is a particular challenge within the police, which is very hierarchical, of accepting that people who are not in that hierarchy or perhaps lower in the hierarchy still have valuable contributions to make. So we found that when it worked well, that whole team could work together to support the individual. And then finally, the thing that we've mentioned a couple of times already is that idea of having a standardized offering, but also allowing the individual to navigate through it in a way that suits their own needs. So you have a standardized reintegration program that involves XYZ as components, and the individual works with the reintegration officer to see which parts suit them at different times or how it might need to be adapted to their needs at that moment. So those are all organisational contextual factors that can improve or detract from the individual's recovery journey. We also have the role of leaders. So perhaps no surprise to anyone that poor leadership results in officers losing respect for the leaders, for the organisation itself, starting to distrust the process, and then disengaging from work as well. For example, the boss just ringing me up, but it wasn't like, I don't know, it didn't feel sincere, just rang up because they had to. And people can tell when it's genuine or sincere. They often mentioned as well that somebody who was genuinely trying to help but didn't find quite the right words was much better than somebody who was just going through it to tick boxes and obviously didn't care about them. So having good leaders being able to lead the way and demonstrate respect and care for their employees is really important. And what we found with that good leadership was that people genuinely felt that support. And they said things like, there's no way you can ever undo what was done, but by crikey, they did try, and to their credit, I give them that respect. So recognising that the incident was a huge challenge, very difficult, it can't be undone, but what we can do is support people and try and help them get back to work. We did find that that good leadership was particularly important for officers that did not have that formal support process, because it was essentially the only way the organisation could demonstrate that it actually cared for them in any way. So we've got the organisational context, we've got the role of the leaders, and then finally we talk to officers about the importance of connection or isolation from their colleagues. Now, there is a fairly unique situation for the police here in that when these incidents happen, some isolation from others is seen as necessary from the investigative process. Part of that investigation process involves getting the officer's statement about what happened, and it's important that that is as little tainted by talking to other people as possible. But again, we found that connection with others is essential for recovery. So there's this important sort of line that they have to travel between making sure that they are isolated enough from other people, but also having that connection and support. So it's important that the organisation can provide some connection in some way and make it clear to the officer when they're allowed to talk to other people and who they can communicate with. Recognising as well that, of course, there are individual differences there. So some people will want to go and talk to others straight away and have that connection. Others would prefer having some time to go through it themselves before they make that connection. But having it available is very important. And related to that is the recognition that after a critical incident, there is a lot of uncertainty and the officers have a real need for information. What's happening? What's going on? What's the process next? And if we can give more clarity on that, it would help support their recovery, because it takes away some of that immediate uncertainty and anxiety. And I've included the following quote as just an illustration of how badly it can go wrong. So this is a couple of hours afterwards, and they're checking on my welfare, and I said, "Oh, how is he?" They said, "Oh, you haven't been told?" And I said, "No." And they said, "Oh, he's passed away." And I was like, "Oh." So this was the first time the officer had been told what had actually happened, and you can see that it was not handled very well. So the more clarity and support we can give around that information and ensuring people have that connection with their colleagues, the better the outcomes will be. So we've gone through quite a lot in terms of how does the critical incident affect people, what's the aim of the reintegration process and how does that work, and then what are some of those wider organisational factors that might influence recovery. From all of this, we've developed some recommendations in terms of what can the police do, but also what can other organisations do to learn from this, and how can we support people in recovery when they go through critical incidents. I've divided this up into two sections. The first is before the critical incident happens, and then what can we do after it happens. So before the critical incident, I've put this developer culture as if it's a very simple thing. We know that developing organisational cultures is not simple, but what we want is a culture that prioritises mental health and supports mental injuries as well as physical ones. So part of how we do that is reduce the stigma associated with seeking help, and we've seen that in the police that has been changing over the last few years. So we're seeing this as a mental health injury rather than something that takes you out of the workforce and you never recover from. So it's an injury in the same way as perhaps breaking your leg is an injury, and there are things we can do to ensure that people get back to work safely and confidently. Part of developing that culture is having leaders in place that prioritise this and make it clear to everyone that this is a priority for the organisation. Another part of it is to make sure that we've got the training in place that's needed. So, for example, for officers and managers, it's useful to give them training on what are our typical responses to distressing events. So what might I expect if I went through one of these events myself? What would I expect my body to do to react? What kind of things would be going on in my mind? And secondly, how could I perhaps support a colleague who went through one of these? We often heard from officers that their colleagues wanted to help but seemed to not know what they could say or how to help. And so it can be useful to give people tips on that in terms of how they can support their colleagues. And then for members of that support team, what is best practice for multidisciplinary teams? How can we ensure that we've got a system in place that can support people when the critical incident happens, and that we've got those open lines of communication? Which brings us on to what happens after the critical incident. Our main finding with the reintegration programme was that to aid recovery, we need to have a standard offering that can be tailored to individual needs. So there definitely needs to be something there, and those three key elements seem to be a good approach to it. So having that peer support, having a focus on operational readiness, and then associated with that, the scene reconstruction to talk about the what-ifs or deal with the doubts. But important to that process is recognising that recovery is not a one-off event. Just like when you break a leg, it's not suddenly it's better 2 weeks later. It's a continuous process. It can involve setbacks. Maybe you overdo it one day and it sets back your recovery a bit. So it's recognising that recovery it's an up and down process, but that for most people it does happen. Secondly, after the critical incident, it's recognising that wraparound support. So not just that one person is there to sort it all out, but that we've got a lot of different people involved in supporting that officer. And we need that interdisciplinary communication and respect. So each person recognising what the other person is contributing to support that officer. and clear procedures and communication that can help reduce uncertainty for the officer themselves. We've seen that a normal response to a critical incident is a lot of anxiety, not sure what's going on, and so one way that the organisation can help that is have those clear procedures in place and just help to reduce the uncertainty in terms of the aftermath. So that is all that I wanted to take you through today. It's been a whistle-stop tour of quite a large project, so I'm very happy to answer any questions. But before we get to that, Devon and I would certainly like to thank some people who were involved in this project. First of all, to all our participants for sharing their stories, because it was the sharing of their stories in a very generous and courageous way, going through some fairly traumatic incidents that they've been through, that has helped us to develop this research and this recommendations for other people. And I believe that from this we can actually help to improve not just what's happening in the police, but hopefully in the wider society in terms of how do we take care of those employees who deal with these difficult events. Secondly, we'd like to mention Jared Walsh and Terry Ann Soul at New Zealand Police, because really it was their passion and support for the research project that made it happen in the first place and that kept us on track through some challenging times. And finally, the team in Edmonton in Canada for generously sharing their time and their expertise at the outset and throughout the research process. So thanks to Chelsea Jones, Colleen Mooney, Suzette Bremo-Phillips and Glenn Close. Okay, so thank you. That's all from me. I'm very happy to answer any questions. But if you would prefer, you can contact me or Devon on those emails below.